Hello, and welcome to another video from The Fisherman's Net. In this series, we're going to look at some of the foundations for life in Christ, or foundations for Catholic morality. And we're going to ask, how do we make moral decisions? What are some of the principles that we use to make those moral choices as Catholics? And in this first video, I'd like to just briefly lay out some of the foundations, our starting point for Catholic morality. So we're going to ask the question, what is the human person? And we're going to ask the question, what is the end or goal or purpose of the human person? And so if we ask about what is the human person, one thing we want to highlight is from the opening chapter of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 tell us that God made the human person in his image and likeness. So we're made in the image of God. And we have to ask, what does that mean? And theologians have pondered this for 2,000 years, for more. But we can say today at least two things in this video. We can say that the human person is created with an intellect and with a will. And this is part of our being created with a spiritual soul. This is what separates us from acorns, algae, antelope, and apes, right? We have this spiritual soul. And as part of this spiritual soul, we have an intellect and a will. So the intellect, our mind, is created to know. And our intellect is created to know something specific, not just to know anything, but to know the truth. And one of the amazing things about our intellect is that we can know the order of this universe that God has created. And not only that, but by the order in the universe, we can come to know God. So we have this intellect made to know the truth. We also have a will. And just as the intellect is made to know, the will is made to choose. And just as the intellect is made to know the truth, the will is made to choose the good. And when we talk about choosing the good or willing the good of another, we call that love, right? So, created in the image and likeness of God, we can know our Creator, we can know the truth and the order of the universe, and we can choose the good. We can love others, and we can love God. And because of this knowledge of the truth, our intellect, and because of our ability to choose the good with our will to love, we're also ordered to our Creator in a way that nothing else is. But let's look at that intellect and will for a moment, because it's not as simple as that. Because we're also not only created in the image and likeness of God, but we're also fallen. We get to Genesis chapter 3 and we see sin enter the picture. And sin had a consequence on this image of God within the human person. In particular, on the intellect and the will, it had an effect. Because of sin, because of inherited original sin, because of our personal sins, we have a few consequences. First, our intellect is darkened. So it's not, the truth is not immediate to us. It takes effort. We can also be blinded from the truth, self-deceptive. We can run from the truth. The truth isn't intuitively known to us. It's difficult to come by. And the will is weakened. So even when we do know the truth, it's difficult to choose the good, right? So in the Garden of Eden, before the fall, Adam and Eve would have known easily the truth and would have easily chosen the good. But for us, as our experience shows, it's a struggle. It's a struggle. Our intellects are darkened, our wills are weakened. St. Paul talks about this in the epistle to the Romans, where he says, I can't do, or I don't do the good that I wish, but I do the evil I don't wish. Right? We call this inclination towards sin that we all have concupiscence. So these are some of the remainders in us, or the effects of original sin. The intellect, which is made to know the truth, that intellect is darkened. And that will, which is made to choose the good, is weakened. We're inclined to sin, and that's called concupiscence. Left in that state, we'd be in trouble. But we have this great salvation in Christ and his gift of grace. And we'll talk about grace later, but we can say for now that two of the effects of grace given to us in Christ are that grace heals us and elevates us. So first, those effects of sin, though they remain, are healed already partially in this life. Through grace, that intellect that's darkened and that will that's weakened are partially healed. We're able, yes, to come to knowledge of God and to choose the good with his grace. And our nature is elevated. We're simply not left at our natural level, but we're brought up to God's level in a sense. We're called to share in the divine nature. And that's the second thing I want to look at. Now, the first we said, well, what is the human person? Created in the image and likeness of God. The second is, what's our goal or our end? We're going to look at life, what we call teleologically, and that's a big word, and it comes from the Greek word telos, which means goal or end. So we're going to look at the human life or the human person through our goal or our end. What's it all about? Where are we headed? We do this all the time. We think teleologically with a goal in mind. If you get in the car and you're going to set out on a destination, if you're like me, one of the first things you do is you plug your destination into the GPS so that you know every turn you're making is based on getting you to your goal. If you don't have a goal in mind when you get in your car, you're just making random turns looking at scenery until you run out of gas. And if our lives aren't teleological, if we don't look at our existence with a goal or a purpose or an end in mind, then really every choice we make, every action we do, is just making random turns, looking at the scenery until we run out of gas. But we want to say, in light of our faith, that we do have an end or a goal or a purpose in mind. Created in the image and likeness of God, we're called to communion with God. And that word communion is very important in our Catholic tradition. Think of communion as an intimate sharing of life and love. We talk about the communion of man and woman in marriage, an intimate sharing in life and love. We talk about the communion of saints, where those in the church have an intimate sharing of life and love. The Blessed Trinity is a communion of persons, an intimate sharing of life and love. We receive communion at Mass, the Holy Eucharist, an intimate sharing of life and love with Christ. So what we're called to, what we're made for in this life is communion with God for eternity, an intimate sharing in life and love. Really to be caught up in the life of the Trinity, this communion, this exchange of life and love. So this is why St. Peter says we're called to participate, to partake in the divine nature, to become like God. And through grace, we're elevated to be able to participate in that communion with God. And here's how the two come together. We're created in the image and likeness of God, and we're called to communion with God. It's through that intellect and will that we know the truth, that we choose the good. It's through that we have freedom. One of the outstanding marks of being in the image and likeness of God is that we have freedom. We have freedom in a way that my cat or my hamster don't. A cat or a hamster, or anything else in this world, can't direct themselves to that final end through their free choices. Our moral acts come from the fact that we have freedom, this intellect and will. We might scold a cat if it does something bad, but we don't think it's morally blameworthy or morally praiseworthy. No, it's only humans who have this intellect, this will, that have the capacity for freedom, that can freely direct their actions towards their end, which is communion with God. So our Catholic moral tradition says each of these actions, these moral actions, flowing from freedom, from intellect and will, either directs us towards God, towards our end, our goal, or away from God, away from our goal. Those that direct us towards God are morally good. Those that direct us away from God, away from our end, are morally bad, morally evil, or we would call them sins. So as we go through these different videos, we're going to look at some of the other foundations of Catholic morality, like conscience and freedom and the virtues and vice, and some very practical considerations for making moral choices. Thank you, and God bless.